Hello and welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Short. My background is in population genomics and studying the genetic causes of rare disease. I did my PhD at the Sanger Institute in the University of Cambridge and have been in biotech since 2018 when I started Sonogenetics. Sonogenetics helps academic and industry researchers to run large-scale genetic testing programs that speed up their clinical trials, generate data sets for the next big breakthrough, and give participants the best possible experience taking part in research. Each episode of the Genetics Podcast, we bring you insights from the leading minds in genetics and precision medicine, including household names and Nobel Prize winners, as well as early career scientists and biotechs working on the next big breakthrough. Whether you are a scientist, entrepreneur, executive, patient advocate, or simply someone curious about how genetics shapes our world, you're in the right place. Thank you for listening, and let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Genetics Podcast. I'm really excited to be here today with Mike Gaziano, who's in the Department of Medicine at Harvard, VA Boston, and Brigham and Women's Hospital. He's one of the two principal investigators of the Million Veterans Program, a program that you've likely heard about if you've listened to this podcast a few times or if you work in the field. If you haven't, it's a national scale research project in the US that's looking at how genes, lifestyle, military experiences, and other exposures affect health and wellness in veterans. And it's really the largest health system-based mega-biobank in the world. Mike was actually recommended by one of our past podcast guests, Alex Bick, who spoke about some work that they did that was really a direct result of the amazing work that's been done in the Million Veterans Program, which was some APOL1 kidney disease research they've done. So we're going to talk a lot about that project today and also Mike's career and thoughts on the future more broadly. So Mike, thank you so much for joining us.
It's really my pleasure to be here.
You've had a couple of, I think, great milestones recently. There was a big paper published just a couple of days ago. You also hit, I think, 1 million veterans enrolled in the program in November 2023. Maybe you can just talk a little bit about the Million Veterans Program, and then we'll go through your background and how you got to work on this really influential project.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Million Veteran Program has been really a great honor for me to be able to play an important role in this generation of population studies. I think this is the most exciting time in population science. And it's because we're at the confluence of three great revolutions. One is that health data of all kinds is now available in electronic form. Genetics and other omics have scaled to the point where we can really measure thousands or millions of things in an automated fashion and make that available. And we have the computers and informatics to make that work. So I think it's the most exciting time in my career as over 3 decades as a population scientist. And being involved in the Million Veteran Program, I think the stars lined up that we had some infrastructure to be able to recruit patients. We have a wonderful health care system with probably the most granular EHR in the country in the Veterans Health Administration, and then we had centralized laboratory and then computing infrastructure to be able to pull it off. So this whole project started about 15 years ago, and it's really been a real pleasure to work in this big MVP family.
Yeah, and talk a little bit about your career prior to MVP, because I think you have had a prepared mind and were directly influenced, I think, for some of the big population health programs you worked on before that weren't necessarily genetics focused because the tools and technology weren't there before. But I'd love to hear a little bit about your career prior to MVP.
Yeah, well, I divide population science into basically 4 phases. The first phase was 150, few hundred years ago when we were just counting things, the descriptive phase. You were counting the bodies. How many plague deaths did you have?
Right.
And the only technology you needed was your fingers and the ability to distinguish a plague death from another death. And your intervention was to put a sign up at the edge of town. And I call that sort of the descriptive phase. Then we moved into the pre-analytic phase, where astute clinicians who were thinking mathematically began making observations without mathematics. So a good example of that is John Snow figuring out that cholera was caused by the water pump in central London, a particular water pump that got contaminated by building a map of the cholera cases that happened to
Mm.
be approximate to that. So this was pre-mathematics. Then we entered the 20th century. Late 19th century, we were moving from sort of rules-based science to probabilistic modeling of science, and that's where statistics was evolved. And that contributed to the evolution of the population science technologies that we used in the day, case control studies, cohort studies, and randomized trials. And it was in that era that I kind of got my start. So the late third era, when I cut my teeth on the physician's health study, brother program to the nurses' health study, women's health study, the Harvard-based big cohorts where tens of thousands or even up to 100,000 individuals were involved in sending health data to us by mail. And they were health professionals because we had to get the data self-reported, and there was no electronic health record. We had to actually review records. And then as I started my career, I had a joint appointment at the VA Boston and the Brigham and Women's Hospital, and it became apparent to me that this backbone of the electronic health record was really going to be valuable and a way to go. It was really back in the late 70s and 80s that the electronic health records were beginning to be developed, first for, say, lab reporting, but the VA was really ahead of the game. And so in 1985, the VA mandated certain elements be in the standardized. Now, things grew up organically in the field. Someone would create an EKG platform, someone would keep a lab platform, but it eventually evolved to a highly granular EHR. And it was there that I realized that we can do some pretty interesting population science with that richness. And the other advantage is the veterans are durably in that system. In the United States, you're in your healthcare plan only about 18 months on average, because you switch employers, your employer switches plans, and then your data's scattered. It's at the primary care place you go to, it's at the imaging center, it's at the CVS, it's at the where you get your drugs. It's where you broke your arm down in Florida, some of your records are there. It's the VA is a national system, and so and patients are durably in that system. And the other big advantage was that veterans are wired for service. They served their country once. They're happy to serve again by being part of research projects. So I applied for and received funding for an epidemiology center at the VA, and that's grown to about 300 employees, and it's somewhere around $50 or $60 million a year as a center. And we were very fortunate to be asked to play a role in the planning of the Million Veteran Program in June of 2009, and we were off and running. 17 months later, in early 2011, we recruited our first patient at the VA Boston. I got to draw the first blood in the Million Veteran Program.
That's amazing.
And then and here we are now, as you mentioned. We were a little slowed down by the pandemic. I think we were recruiting at about 100,000 a year. We in sites. And we knew our veterans were willing to serve and willing to come in. We did most of the data collection from the veterans were paper forms, but now we've moved to an online platform. By November the 8th at about 3:42 in the afternoon, the ticker crossed the million mark. So we were able to celebrate that wonderful achievement. And we're still going.
Yeah. What is there a new target in mind, or is it open-ended?
So in one sense, it's open-ended, but there are some targets. And the main goal of this next phase, so that we race to 1 million. What's really wonderful is that the population that uses the VA is quite a diverse population. It's a high proportion of people with lower socioeconomic status. About 20% of the users, 19-20%, are of African ancestry. We have about 8 or 9% that are Hispanic ethnicity, and that's what's reflected in the Million Veteran Program. And what we want to do is move more in that direction. We want to diversify the cohort even more. Now, obviously, at our centers, we won't turn anybody away, but we're going to have targeted recruitment for more women and for all of the underrepresented groups, and a focus on individuals who are rurally based. And that's where some of our online, platforms seem to help. And we also want to try to attract more younger individuals.
Right. And you all have kind of developed in parallel with UK Biobank and some of the other major programs in other parts of the world. And you've not had the benefit of hindsight to say they did it this way. Programs that are starting today will look at UK Biobank and probably do things really differently. So what's interesting about that is you've made different decisions along the way because you didn't have that benefit of hindsight. How have you thought about like the diversity of omics in the program? Because you have
Yeah. Well,
imaging, you have genetics, you have proteomics. How have you thought about that?
yeah, well, it is a platform, and I think you're absolutely your prelude to that question about making the reality of the cohort fit the reality of the infrastructure of the
Mhm.
healthcare system. Now, we chose to do it within our system, and somebody said, well, could you have recruited spouses? Yes, sure, we could have, or kids, and that there would have been some scientific advantages to that. But one disadvantage was we don't have the health records for those individuals.
Right.
So we designed the cohort that fit our assets. And so we have, data that I divide our data collection into two forms, passive and active. And then we'll get to the one you mentioned. One of the elements of active is the biospecimen is collected under consent, and we do special things with it. So are the questionnaires that we get from the individuals. Those are collected, those are part of a research operation. All the passive collection is the electronic health record, what's available that comes over from the Department of Defense about the health status of individuals when they were in active service. We have some people that are duly enrolled in the VA and Medicare, and so we get some leakage into the private sector, but we get the claims data for Medicare. We get the National Death Index for cause of death. We have our own administrative files for the timing of death. So these are what I call passive collection.
Mm.
The participant doesn't have to do anything for us to get that information. The actively collected things are things that a questionnaire that we send out. We have a baseline questionnaire, and then we have a longer lifestyle questionnaire that has things like an anxiety index, a depression index, a food frequency questionnaire, and then we collect the biospecimen. And now what do we do with the biospecimen? Well, our approach has generally been to store the Buffy coat and extract a small amount of DNA, and then we send that DNA out for genotyping for everybody. We're doing a very large subsample with sequencing and methylation. And then we're taking the plasma and sending it out for metabolomics and exploring in proteomics as well, as are many of the biobanks. And we certainly look to what the UK Biobank is doing, what the All of Us cohort is doing, what our what cohorts around the world are doing, and we try to see what direction things are moving. And our decisions are primarily, the greatest good for the greatest number. I mean, our plasma samples are a limited resource, and so
Yes.
we don't send specimens out to individual investigators to do their own thing. We make a decision collectively to try to understand where the field is going and to generate a resource that will be of the greatest use to the greatest number of investigators. And that's a challenge to try to balance the availability of technology today and with the direction that it's moving.
What are some of the most impactful scientific findings, both for the field, but also, just thinking about you personally and your career? What are the things when you look at results that have come out of the program that are most interesting or impactful to you?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's really a wonderful question, and I think that a lot of that is obviously in the eye of the beholder. I think you can ask the same questions about the Harvard-based cohorts that I've been involved in, where there's actually thousands of publications from the nurses' health study, physicians' health study collectively. And I think that the first issue, the first thing is just in generally speaking, that I think there's a very important role for investment in these kind of large enterprises. They provide an opportunity, in many ways to understand, at least to understand the population that's included. So we see about 9 million veterans every year. And when we've got a million in, now we've got those million in over a decade. And so, it's not, exactly a 10% cut of the population, but it's a very representative group. Now, they're volunteers. They're not completely identical to the population, but they represent the population. And I'll give you an example of how this was used in real time in real world. Was the pandemic hit, and we needed to answer some questions about COVID. And so we had a cohort. We were able to send a questionnaire out. We got 250,000 questionnaires back. We were able to do some pretty interesting science. One of our first Mendelian randomizations was looking at potential variants that were related to existing drugs that were also related to bad outcomes in COVID. So having a cohort in place allows you to that was what I think a very exciting moment. Just thinking about recent events. I mean, we're coming up on about 400 publications from the study, and I think our data has been used in meta-analyzed subsequently in several hundred more. So the data is out there, and it's in the hands of many investigators now worldwide. Now, the paper that we talked about earlier that came out last Friday was a paper in Science where we took all of the imputed variants for about 630,000 individuals, and we looked at the relationship between all of those variants and 2,100 phenotypes, 2,100 disease outcomes, laboratory values, traits based on responses to the questionnaire. And we just published those results in Science, and those summary estimates are now available to the world, and we've released those to the world to be added to the body of information. And one of the things that I'm very excited about is that we've added considerably to some of the underrepresented groups. We added considerably to those of African ancestry, with us being about 19%. And one of the most interesting things about the results from that analysis was when we considered the diversity, we added knowledge gain not only in those diverse populations, underrepresented populations, but also in the European population. So by having that diversity, I think it was enhanced everything. It enhanced discovery in general for everybody. And the other really interesting thing is that this was done in collaboration with the Department of Energy on their supercomputer, called Summit at the Oak Ridge National Lab, where we had very high quality informaticians that were helping us to solve this massive problem. I think if we were to run these on our own computers behind the VA firewall, it would have taken us about 8 years to run the analysis. And the way our DOE colleagues were able to structure the analysis on this at one time, the largest parallel processing environment, they were able to run it in a matter of weeks.
That kind of leads on to a question that I had about what the challenges were that came with scale in this. You probably experienced scaling challenges on the sample collection side, on the fielding questionnaires to 250,000 people at once, and then it sounds like on the analytics side as well. What were the big things as you went from 100,000 to 1 million, and then also as you think about going from 1 million to maybe closer to the full 9 million that you see a year in time? What are the challenges that you anticipate getting harder, where you need some new smart people to think about things to really get that?
Well, I tell you what, that's a great question, and there's lots of elements that needed to be considered to scale. But I just starting with your last comment, wouldn't it be wonderful if when you came into a health system like the VA, you're enrolling in the VA, they said, would you like to have a blood specimen sent to our national clinical biobank? Because then we can, whenever you need genetic testing, we'll have your specimen already there.
Yes.
And it was as a clinical tool. And then, geez, wouldn't that feed a wonderful research enterprise as well? This idea of the health system being a learning healthcare system more suited to both providing, optimal state-of-the-art clinical care, but also being able to enhance discovery.
Yeah.
Now, to scale on any level, whether it was getting patients to be consented, we started off with paper consent and verbal face-to-face explanation of what we were doing. Then we were able to create an online version of that. Sample collection was a challenge. The technique that we used was chilled specimens sent on wet ice overnight and processed centrally, rather than relying on every site having to process the specimens themselves, because there's just no way to maintain consistency when that many sites are processing the biospecimens. So in my early days in the physician's health study and the women's health study, with standing on the shoulders of others who have gone before me, I helped develop a strategy to take those wet specimens, those specimens sent to us on wet ice overnight, and process them and put them into deep storage for genetics and plasma or serum-based study in the future. And that's basically what we set up in about 20 years ago at the what's now called the VA Central Biorepository, that's based in Boston at the Jamaica Plain campus of the VA Boston. So that was another element of scale. I'll talk about two other dimensions amongst the many that we could be talking about. But one is just the scale of the data extraction and the quality of the data that we get out of the EHR. So we created a phenomic core, which has evolved into a phenomic engine that we call Cypher. And we now have 7,000 phenotypes that range from a simple ICD or procedure code to a very complex algorithm. And how do we catalog that? And investigators come and deposit their algorithms in the publications that go along with that. There's some provenance and was it validated, against, case records, et cetera. But the processing of the data is also a new science. I mean, I consider myself a phenomicist. Phenomic medicine should be a new field of medicine. And we're trying to share best practices. So, and anybody who wants can go to that Cypher webpage. And actually, we have a special landing page that takes the 2,100 phenotypes that are in that science paper, and it makes it easy for you to pull those out from the 7,000 phe codes that are in the library. The third element of scale is what do you do with the biospecimens? And I will tell you that even a few $100s a person adds up a lot when you're trying to measure a million individuals, right? So you've got some real decisions to make on which technologies are you going to use, which genotype platform, which imputation standard. Same questions about who's going to do the sequencing for you, and how can you manage the data with all that comes, and then even the mathematics that I think we're still, I think we've come a long way, but I think we still don't have the mathematics completely worked out to deal with this. I think we're using 20th century statistics that was developed largely to test one hypothesis at a time.
Right.
And here we are testing 50 million at a time.
Right. It's a lot of areas to consider. On the finance side of things, the something that the UK programs have really leaned into is these public-private partnerships. UK Biobank has worked with pharma consortiums. The new Our Future Health program is doing the same. But it hasn't really been a big part of all of us, as far as I can tell, and I don't think it's been a big part of Million Veterans as well. Is that kind of a structural thing where there's plenty of funding that comes through on the VA side, or how do you think about those kind of public-private partnerships? Because at some point the cost of these becomes enormous, but it could be a NIH veterans kind of funded program forever. But I'm sure you have these kind of conversations all the time, and I'm
Yeah.
curious about the
Well,
constraints
we're
there.
very lucky that our head of research, previous head of research, Tim O'Leary, and the current head of research, Rachel Ramoni, and the program director, the director of the MVP program, Suma Muraladhar, have been very capable in garnering the resources that we are most appreciative of to support the program on the one hand. On the other hand, the resources are limited, and the UK Biobank has a very interesting model. They do these public-private partnerships, but some of those public-private partnerships require some sort of data sharing, or allowing access to the data from the private entity for some period of time in advance of when it's being made public. Now, we have not only like everybody, we share this moral and ethical responsibility, but we also have even a national security issue about our data and our data sharing practices, because the health of our veterans could be used in nefarious ways by bad actors. So we have a special reason that we have to keep our data
Yeah.
secure. And so the ability for us to share individual level data is really one of the main challenges that we have. Now, we are sharing our data, and we deposit on dbGaP the summary results. We have several platforms where we're going to be sharing the summary estimates of these results. But that's one issue that is a challenge for
Yeah.
us in terms of being able to enter in some types of public-private partnerships. Although we do to the extent that we can, we have arrangements that certainly are favorable given the volume and the importance of the project.
Yeah, the constraints that you talk about on the national security side are they're real, right? And it's a really challenging question, because you don't know what you don't know with some of these big data sets, right? And so there is a precautionary principle at play that if you share too liberally and you make a mistake, then there's no winding it back, right? So you're walking a very careful line there, which I totally appreciate.
Yeah, and I would say that it takes you years to develop a culture and a good relationship, and a trusting relationship, and we use sort of a trust model with our veterans. And I'm so pleased. Our motto for the Million Veteran Program came from our veterans, and they just kept telling, "Oh, it's just another way to serve." Well,
I love that.
that's the model. It's another way to serve. And in other programs that I've been involved in, I serve on advisory boards for the UK Biobank and several other biobanks. But there's often a question, well, how do we get people to join, and what do we have to pay them, and what do we have to get back to them? And I'm just very fortunate that the veterans, when we ask them, would you be part of this study, their response to us, well, will this help other veterans? Not
Right.
what will I get out of this? It says, will this help other veterans? So what people don't realize is that the VA is a very special place that's beyond healthcare, because these people are bonded in a special way, and they support each other. And I would just give you an example of that. I'm a cardiologist that practices. I still practice in the hospital, and I used to run a program called the Heartbeats, and these were a bunch of veterans that had bypass surgery, and they would look at the schedule, and they'd go into the room of a veteran night before they were supposed to have bypass surgery. They'd pull up a chair, and they'd say, I had bypass surgery 3 years ago. You got any questions?
Right.
Now, and the veteran knows that that guy is there because they're brothers or sisters, and
Yeah.
they're sometimes bonded in 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 strife,
Yeah.
under tough circumstances. But think about this, at other hospitals, a stranger comes into your room and sits down in a chair, and the question might say, "Who are you?" But
Right.
these guys are
You're not my
bonded.
doctor. Yeah.
Yeah, these guys are bonded in a special way to each other, and about 30 or 40% of the employees of the VA are veterans. There's an army of volunteers that come around. People come there to socialize. So that was the spirit at which with which the Million Veteran Program, and they asked us, one thing is that, we want you, a couple things, and that we promised. This is our part of the bargain. We're going to use the most of this data to do discovery that's going to help veterans and everybody else too.
Yeah.
But we'll as best we can in this world that we live in today, that we're gonna try to secure their privacy and keep their data secure. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm interested in getting your perspective on the kind of dual research and clinical impacts, but I have a really interesting kind of connection that I made while doing the prep for this episode, which was a couple of months ago. I was trying to decide if I should take a multivitamin, and every article you read says either they're the best thing ever or there's no evidence. But you actually did the study in 2012, and I came across I
Yeah,
think it was in the Physicians Health Program,
yeah,
and
yeah.
I thought that was super cool. And that is an example of, I'll let you talk a little bit about that study, but that was to me an example of research influencing care over in a kind of indirect way. Doctors read papers, I read papers, and you make decisions based on it. But within MVP and other kind of similar health system aligned biobanks, that feedback loop can be a lot tighter. Yeah, I'd love to just, if
Yeah,
you could
sure.
explain to everybody that multivitamin study,
That was a
and then
very
we can talk
fun
about the
study to
program.
do. And I would say that we use observational cohorts like the Million Veteran Program, to explore hypotheses, and to generate questions that sometimes a randomized trial is necessary. And in the 80s and early 90s, there was a lot of nutritional epidemiology that was telling us that vitamin E was great for you and beta carotene would prevent cancer, and all. Vitamin C was going to make you live to 100. And there were some that was, well, the observational evidence was so strong, we don't need to do randomized trials. These are such safe things. But truth is that they're important questions. So if you're taking vitamin E instead of taking your statin, you better be sure that you're getting the benefit that you think you are. So we
Right.
launched a number of studies to determine whether or not beta carotene, vitamin E, vitamin C in men and women, in the women's health study and physicians health study, were in fact as beneficial as some of the observational studies would suggest. And it turns out that all of the results were essentially null. No one had ever done at that point a trial of just a standard multivitamin. And so at the end of the day, when I'm trying to take these back to the clinic, so we ran a big trial where we gave a multivitamin for a long period of time in these physicians, and they reported back their endpoints, and we confirmed those with the painstaking going through the medical records and all
Yeah.
that. And we showed that it didn't prevent cardiovascular disease, but there was a suggestion of a 10% reduction in all-cause cancers. And so, my feeling is that a multivitamin, particularly for older individuals, where we're not sure that we get the diverse enough diet, that a multivitamin first and foremost, does ensure that we're not deficient in any of the vitamins. And
Yeah.
our study suggested there could possibly be some health benefits, although there haven't been another confirmatory study, particularly in men, to suggest that it actually does prevent chronic diseases of any kind. So I think it was an illustration that a randomized trial is all these wonderful things that we can do with, making inferences from whether they be genetic studies or a causal inference modeling or other techniques that we use to maybe simulate a randomized trial. There's still some value in
Yeah.
actually randomizing people to the placebo or the vitamin and seeing what it actually does in the real world over time.
Yeah, definitely. As we wrap up here, I'd love to just explore that theme more broadly of research and healthcare, and how they're actually coming together and maybe tightening that feedback loop in terms of speed. What have you found from
Yeah, well,
MVP?
I hope that this era, as I told you, it's just an exciting time to be a population scientist, and I hope that we're knocking down a couple of walls. So the basic scientists used to live in one part of the ivory tower, and thus, clinical population scientists lived in another, and that wall is coming down because, as we've talked about, we're doing some highly sophisticated mechanistic studies embedded in these large cohorts. So that's one barrier. The second barrier that you're directly talking about in your last question is the barrier between research and clinical care. And now with the availability of a massive amount of health data, it means that we can be discovering things that may have applicability sooner rather than later. Can we shorten the cycle from basic mechanistic understanding to an animal study to a small population study to a big randomized trial? Can we shorten that time frame? And people use the term precision medicine. Well, I like to think we've been trying to be as precise as we can, applying things to an individual as best we can, but we may discover things, whether it be genetic or other omic, or even from the health system data. We're applying with some caveats of the understanding the validity of these artificial intelligence. We might be able to detect an individual who's at higher risk for a future important event, a cancer, a cardiovascular death. That could be from an algorithm from the EHR, or it could be an algorithm that includes clinical EHR data and genetics, or a protein scan that says, well, see, these proteins that are in your blood, this collection of proteins, suggest that you might be at risk. And I think that the cautionary message is that we can actually perhaps shorten the time to developing a drug by some of these Mendelian randomization techniques, where you look at a variant. That's how PCSK9 inhibitors, a drug for cholesterol, came about. On the one hand, on the other hand, as we were talking about with the vitamins, I think we still need to apply the same set of rules for certainty that the intended drug or predictive algorithm behaves in the real world as we think that it does in the research environment.
Right.
So I think we have the possibility to compress the cycle of developing a new drug or predictive analytics, but we still have to test those. If we develop something in one population, with an AI engine, we need to ask the questions: Does it behave the same in another population, or do I get the same answer if I use someone else's different AI engine? These are important questions I think we have to answer. But I do think that this era of population science will accelerate discovery and perhaps accelerate the implementation of that discovery to improving health in the clinical setting or in everyone's daily life.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, I just want to say thank you for sharing all this rich experience with us. I've been, wanting to learn more about MVP for a while because it's just one of the few programs that is operating at this incredible scale. And there's just so much that I think you all have to teach to other people through the data sets that you create and are sharing, but also through the learnings of probably sometimes very painful of how to scale these kind of programs. So thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Absolutely. It was really my pleasure. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Me too. That wraps up this week's episode of the Genetics Podcast. I'd like to give a huge thank you to our guests for sharing their valuable insights and experience. And thank you as well to our listeners, as always, for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's talk, the number one thing I would really appreciate from you is if you could share it with a friend or colleague who you think would enjoy it as well. We would also really appreciate if you could subscribe to our show and give us a quick rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Both of these things help us become more visible when people search for genetics and precision medicine podcasts. And we're always eager to hear from you. Please reach out to us with any questions or feedback on social media. You can find Cynogenetics on Twitter, LinkedIn, or visit cynogenetics.com. Finally, a big thank you to the team behind the scenes who make all this possible, in particular Amy Cousins and Sonia Shah who produced the show, and James Pierce from Selected Frequencies who handles the audio engineering. I'm Patrick Short, your host, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you, and we'll see you next time on the Genetics Podcast.